The following is a Barrett Sports Media production. There are two sides to the broadcast industry: content creators and moneymakers. This podcast is for that second group: sellers, buyers, managers, anyone with an interest in business. You're all welcome here. This is Seller to Seller. Now, here's your host, Jeff Cabes.
The podcast movement has came and went, but there's been a lot of information about podcasting. Of course, anybody that's in sales has been asked to sell a podcast or two with your spot schedules or whatever other digital packages that you've been handed off. Let's get more in depth with it with Seth Ressler, my guest. He's a digital strategist. You probably read some of Seth's stuff, as I do, at Jacobs Media. He works with radio stations, designing, implementing websites and social media and email marketing, SEO, content marketing, which I've talked to him about, lead generation, which I've written about with Seth, and other online things. He's also the founder of Community Marketing Revolution, producing branded podcasts and virtual events for organizations. I'm sure we'll touch on that because I think that's very interesting. Seth, you were here in Dallas for the podcast movement, and not everybody may understand exactly what that is. So talk to us about that. And I imagine it's got everybody that's anybody in that industry, including you, that were there.
Just a fantastic conference that has really grown quite a bit over the years and brings together everybody who's in the space. When I first started going, I think that second year that they had it, there were 5 radio guys maybe at the conference, and 4 of them were unemployed. And now, you see a lot of the big broadcasters and more people in suits and ties moving into the space.
Right.
The space has really matured in quite a bit.
You bathe in it, you work in it. What percentage of the podcasters would you say are doing it for fun? And how much are the suits behind now? Terms of what you can tell, because there are thousands of podcasts.
There are millions. If you look at Spotify, saying that they've got millions of podcasts now on the site. But if you start looking at how many of them are actually active, Steve Goldstein of Amplify Media had a good analysis of this that he did with James Cridlin and Pod News, looking at it was about 250,000, I believe, that are actually active. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of what you call pod fade, which is people that, they come in, they do a couple of episodes, they figure out that podcasting is harder than they thought it was going to be. I would say the vast majority of people are, doing it for fun, or while they may hope to turn it into a business, have not necessarily figured out exactly how to do it yet. I mean, I still think it's the minority at the top that are making real money doing this. But I think the secret for a lot of the people that I know who have been successful has been diversifying the revenue stream, not just counting on podcast ads. And they are also signing book deals, or, speaking, or they're getting hired as consultants, or they're doing some other thing that also generates revenue for them.
Yeah, you would say then that on some level, and you're counseling a lot of these people with branded podcasts, this is another marketing tool in their chest, right?
And I think the revenue models are still emerging. I don't think that there is, the way we have in radio, there's one path of, okay, this is how we do it, and this is how it works, and this is the path that we can all follow to make revenue. I think everybody's journey is a little bit different, and I don't think everybody can make that Joe Rogan journey and do the same thing.
All right, help us out here. We read a lot about programmatic advertising. A lot of us sell advertising day to day. And we understand, there's just people that are automated, and they're just sending an insertion order, and it's getting spread across any digital audio medium they can find. So this is all the rage, and it was discussed quite a bit at the movement. So explain it and talk to me about how it will be something that will help a lot of podcasters.
Yeah, programmatic ads have been held up for a long time as a big hope in the podcasting industry, as a way that we're finally going to be able to monetize. In the beginning, when you created the audio for the episode, you also recorded the audio for the ad, and you uploaded it all as one file. No matter where you were downloading that episode, you heard the same ad. No matter what time, whether it was now or 5 years from now, you were hearing the same ad. That's a baked in ad. And then we got to the point where we could do dynamically inserted ads, which meant that the ads were inserted not at the time that the audio file is uploaded, but at the time that the audio file is downloaded by the listener to their device. Now that we've got dynamically inserted ads, the question is, can we sell them programmatically? And the answer is yes. The technology is getting better and better and allowing us to then go in and target certain demographics, certain areas. Really, this year, I think the conversation turned to, not when we could do this, but how can we do this effectively now? And that's what a lot of the conversation was about. I'm less excited than other people.
Why?
Because I'm less excited about ads than
Right.
other people.
We're gonna get to that.
Look, my background is in commercial radio. You know what people like least about commercial radio? I'll give you a hint. It's in the name.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
That's right.
people don't like ads. And
Right.
I'm concerned that we're rushing to place ads in this new media when we know that it's largely the thing that people don't like in old media. But there is research out there that says, look, people understand that if they're going to get this media for free, it's got to get paid for somehow. And the ad is the price that they're willing to pay.
So, Seth, how is the programmatic handled? In other words, who's the clearinghouse? Are the Spotify's and the iHearts, they have the software that dynamically inserts things? So you go through them. I imagine they're going to take a cut. I mean, we're starting to get this thing organized. In what way?
Yeah, you're starting to see those companies making a lot of acquisitions, and other companies, Libsyn acquiring AdvertiseCast and things like that. So yeah, they're all trying to put that technology in there.
All right. So you mentioned about advertising being an objection, and the number of ads is always something that I'm sure salesmen would like to see go up. I think you and I are on the same page. I think listeners, one is too many. I mean, what does the research say about the opportunity to just zip on your phone when you're listening to a podcast right past commercials?
As you know, I've worked in 6 or 7 radio stations, and in every radio station, the relationship between the sales department and the program department is somewhere between frosty and all-out warfare. And it's because exactly what you say. The sales department would love to run 60 ads an hour, and the programming department would like to run 0. I think you're going to start seeing that tension creep into podcasts. And already, we were seeing some signs at Podcast Movement of research that said people are starting to worry about the amount of ads in their favorite podcasts. So look, I think it is something to be concerned about and to pay attention to. And, I am a little concerned that podcasts may repeat some of the mistakes that radio has made when it comes to commercial loads.
Yeah. And I just wonder how much of revenue we're really talking about. Somebody say, I have an industry pod right here, seller to seller through Barrett Sports Media. And the minute, we get X amount of downloads and an advertiser. Well, how much of that money is really going to trickle through to the person doing the podcast, or, the what they're paying for these, in other words, is really not much.
Yeah. I think the economic models are still not 100% apparent. One of the things that I'm paying attention to was a fantastic podcast called In the Dark that was put out by Minnesota Public Radio. And this is one of those things where it takes a team of people, a year or more to go out and do some really hardcore, fantastic reporting. And it's a fantastic podcast, and it got lots of downloads and won awards, but they had to discontinue it after 2 seasons because they couldn't find a sponsor for episode 3. And, quite frankly, it's easier to just get a couple of comedians in a room and have them just talk for an hour because the overhead is much lower. And so I wonder how that's going to shake out over the long term, kind of in the way that, look, it's easier to make HGTV and, or more cost effective to run game shows than it is to try and make Game of Thrones. And I think, you're always going to have people who want to make that HBO level quality show and really aim for that and, succeed at that and perhaps even are able to monetize it. But there's also money in kind of the cheap, dirty, let's make game shows.
You touched on this, and you wrote about it in your article that you can find at Jacobs Media. That you've got the big media companies now saying they're willing to produce a podcast if it's got sponsors and the spend is enough. So
Yes.
explain that to us, and how does this work?
Yeah, so I have always been bullish on the branded content play in the podcasting space. I actually like it better than the advertising space, which is not to say that there aren't going to be people who make money in both ways. But the idea is, if you're a company, what you want to do is create content. I mean, we've seen content marketing for a long time now. It's just the idea that a podcast can be part of that, content that you're using to market your company. And so you go out and you create a branded podcast, a podcast that, is about your company or promotes your company in some ways. I think the example that a lot of us have been citing for a long time is the fantastic Inside Trader Joe's podcast that was put together by Dave Beasing, who's a former radio program director. He's formed a company called Sounds That Brand. And that's what they do, is they produce these branded podcasts. I think that play makes sense, but what's happening is you're getting paid by the marketing department basically as a line item in their budget. And so it's not dependent to the same extent on the number of downloads you get and then advertising revenue. This is not the model of, hey, we're going to create a podcast from scratch and hope it gets 1 million downloads and go try and put stamps.com reads in it. This is a marketing play. Of course, even if you make a branded podcast, you still need to get people to listen to it.
Sure.
And iHeart seems uniquely positioned to be able to do this. This is why I've always liked established media companies getting into the branded podcast space, because if you already own a bunch of radio stations or television stations or newspapers, you not only have the tools to make this branded content, but then you have the tools to get that branded content in front of an audience as well. Dave Beasing put together a great panel on branded podcasts. And one of the things that iHeart said in a moment that was more candid than frankly I expected is they said, look, we put together some really, really great podcasts for some big clients that we charged a lot of money for. And then they didn't want to spend additional money on top of that to market the podcast once it was done. And the result was that we had some podcasts that were really good that got very, very few downloads. And we figured out really quickly that was not going to work. And so they changed their model and said, look, if you spend X number of dollars on a media spend, we will then produce the podcast for you at no cost. And that's a brilliant move, I think. I just think I was just like, wow.
Let's see how the talent's getting paid. You know how that goes, right? Guys on salary, and they're tapping you on the shoulder.
That the media spend is big enough that it's going to cover all those costs and expenses, and that everybody's, is going to get paid. But, I thought that was a good move. And I thought that posed a real threat to companies that are production houses that don't own a lot of radio stations or television stations or media outlets. That made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. So in this scenario, you've got a company like iHeart who can promote it on their stations, and you have, let's just say, Vans tennis shoes. They want a podcast about the lifestyle of the Vans tennis shoe, and that could be a skateboard, it could be surfing. On average, Seth, what's the pitch back? We'll do a podcast a week, a podcast a month. We'll do a series of podcasts, because I'm sure if they get into the daily podcast business, now you're getting into a different scenario altogether. What's the norm in those branded podcasts?
Well, if I understand what you're asking, I mean, maybe the question is, what is the play if you're not iHeart, if you're not the biggest radio company out there? And look, I still think you've got to play if you own 17 radio stations in Ohio. I just don't think you're going after the same customers, but there's going to be small, medium, or regional companies that you could still produce a branded podcast for. I think there's a model there. Frankly, I don't think every branded podcast needs to sound like This American Life. I think there's a lot of companies out there that could go for a lower cost podcast that's, a series of one-on-one interviews that, as long as it really matches the needs of their clients or their customers, can still be very, very effective.
One a week?
I think for companies, I think you can come out and you can produce in seasons. There's going to be times where it makes sense to do it on a regular basis. But I think it's also okay to come out with an episode that's a season that's 6 episodes long or 8 episodes long or 10 episodes long. And if the content is evergreen and if it's still relevant 3 years from now, 5 years from now, there's still going to be life in it.
Let me ask you about one other thing. So much of our attention in the podcasting space is geared at somebody on the move, the drive to work, maybe a workout, some yard work. And none of those things would require that I had a YouTube component to it, that I want to watch talking heads rather than listen to it and be on the move. But I know at the podcast movement, you guys covered this and talked about the YouTube piece. And what's your analysis of this, Seth, about how many of us should be putting everything on YouTube versus just putting it out as an audio-only pod?
Yeah, first of all, one of the things that surprised me from the research that I saw at Podcast Movement this year is that the car is not the primary place for podcast listening right now. It's at home. And I saw this in a couple of research studies, and that there's still, they argue that there's a lot of room for growth in the car, which is interesting because I've also been speaking at radio conferences, recently where we've been talking about not allowing other people into the car to erode, this place that we hold so dear. YouTube's an interesting question. And I have gotten different answers talking to different people. I mean, if you talk to the researchers, they will talk about how YouTube is a really big player in the podcast space, arguably bigger than Spotify. If you talk to some of the podcast veterans, they will say that, look, if you go through the top 100, top 200 podcasters and look at their YouTube presence, very few of them have a big YouTube presence. Somebody like Joe Rogan is actually the exception to the rule. So it's not clear. Potentially one of the places where YouTube could be powerful is that YouTube is a really good search engine. And again, it's owned by Google, the biggest search engine. YouTube itself is the second biggest search engine in the world. And Apple Podcasts, which is the number one place that people find podcasts, is not a good search engine. So perhaps that searchability could, bring some discoverability to podcasts. I think the one thing that you are hearing people say is that one, it's not that hard to throw your podcast up on YouTube. Your host may have automatic integration so that with a single click, it just gets pushed out to YouTube with a static image. And if nobody watches it, that's fine. At least it's there. It's not that hard to make an audiogram in something like Headliner, which is just a static image with a sound wave over it.
Right.
So that if people, do happen to listen to your podcast on YouTube, they can find it. But if you're really going to succeed in YouTube and at video, you actually got to do video.
You got to stage it. What I mean? You got to do more than talking heads. You need video.
You got to sit there and you got to do the lighting and you got to do get a real camera and put some effort into it. The way we think of media tends to be very siloed. We tend to think about television or radio or movies or podcasts, and people tend to get hung up on that. One of the things that I'm finding in my own media consumption is that I don't subscribe to CNN, or cable news through my cable provider, but I consume a lot of CNN, and I do it by calling it up through Alexa. I know some of my colleagues call it up on satellite radio. And so I am frequently in a position where I listen to CNN, but do not watch it. Right. And it's interesting because if you watch some of these cable channels, they figured that out and they have adjusted their language slightly.
Do you think the average podcaster who's, really not making that much, radio station guys that have to throw a podcast out there because they're a talk show host or whatever, do you think that talking head should be thrown up on YouTube or just forget about it?
I don't think it's radically more expensive to do it. I think the tools have come down in price. I think that, I've been spending most of the pandemic playing with Ecamm Live, which is a video streaming software that allows me to make stuff that looks like cable news, or as good as the local news channel. But I think not enough people are talking about, let's make a video and then also rip the audio and make it available in a place that people can consume it either way and they have the choice.
Seth, this has been very interesting. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I love your stuff. I love reading it, what you tweet out on social media and what you're doing with content marketing, a lot of others. So I really appreciate you joining me.
Cool. Well, thank you for having me. This is great. I love talking about this stuff.
All right. You can find more about Seth at Jacobs Media. You can rate, review, and pass along this pod. You can write to me, jeffcase54@gmail.com. Give me some topics. Any great conversation like this you'd like to hear. Reach out to me if you're near Flower Mound, Dallas, or Texas. And check out my articles on sports radio sales at barrettsportsmedia.com. Talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to Seller to Seller with Jeff Caves. Each episode is available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, the iHeart app, and most podcasting platforms. To stay in touch with Jeff, follow him on Twitter @Jeff Caves and read his sales columns on barrettsportsmedia.com.